Okay, so our next two poetic terms are diction and imagery. I'll start with diction. In order to talk about it, here's a quote from Lawrence Perrin, the author of a book called Sound and Sense. He says, "A primary distinction between the practical use of language and the literary use is that in literature, especially in poetry, a fuller use is made of individual words. In other words, a poet is an artist, and words are his or her medium. And because the poem has a limited number of words in it, each word that a poet puts in must be chosen very carefully and thought over a lot. Unlike when we just speak in ordinary language to each other in prose, we have a sense of what we want to say, and we begin speaking and we kind of cast around for the right words and that kind of thing and just keep moving on, right? You don't do that in poetry. You might begin that way, perhaps, but then the poet goes back and revises and cuts and changes and revises again. So the words that are given to you as a reader of poetry are words that were all very carefully chosen. And because they're so very carefully chosen, it makes sense to pay very close attention to the exact words that were chosen. This is why, unlike reading prose, in a poem, you can't just gloss over a word that you don't know. In prose, all the time we do this. We have 20 pages to read, let's say, and we come across a word we don't know, and we just sort of figure it out from the context. We have a pretty good hunch of what it means, and we move on. And that's fine, unless it's a very important word in the passage, I guess. But in poetry, all the words are important words in the passage. In poetry, if you come across a word that you don't know, you have to stop and look it up. Perrin continues, "A frequent misconception of poetic language is that the poet seeks always the most beautiful or noble sounding words. What he really seeks are the most meaningful words. The poet chooses the words that will convey the most meaning in that situation. And because the poet does that, we, as readers, as close and careful readers of poetry, should look very carefully at which words were chosen." So to do that, we use the term diction in literary studies, and we use the term diction in one of two ways. So first of all, we can characterize the language used throughout the whole work, right? This could be a whole novel or story or poem. We can say, for example, that Mark Twain writes in vernacular diction, meaning vernacular means the way that ordinary people speak, right? Or we can say that a particular passage or poem is written in academic diction, right? Meaning there are a lot of like school words and so on in the poem. So we can characterize the whole thing in some way, using any adjective that we could find to characterize a bunch of words. But we can also discuss the effects of an individual word choice. In other words, we can ask the question, why did she or he choose this word for this place in the poem? So poets are concerned with three aspects of a word's meaning: denotation, connotation, and sound. I'll start with sound, actually. I won't spend a whole lot of time on it, except to say that, like musicians, poets are concerned with the way the word sounds in your ear when you read it aloud, or in your mind when you read it silently. So sound is an important aspect for the poet, right? Because that's the art form of poetry. It's both sound and sense, to take Perrin's title of his book, right? It both means something, and then it is something. It's a work of art created a certain way, and so the poet's concerned with with what sounds ugly or sounds beautiful or sounds powerful or moving, depending on what he or she needs. But let's spend some more time on the first two, denotation and connotation. Denotation just means the dictionary definition of a word, right? And again, if you don't know that in a poem, you have to look it up. Connotation is a bit more interesting. Connotation, that is the associations evoked by a word beyond its literal meaning. Okay, well, what do I mean by that? Perhaps the best way to see this is with some examples. We have all sorts of words that their denotation is either identical or very, very close. but their connotations, their associations that will be evoked in a listener or in a reader are very different. So, for example, to be called childlike and childish, according to their dictionary definitions, they mean very close to the same thing. But the connotations of the two are very different, right? It would be a good thing to be called childlike in most situations, but it's always a bad thing to be called childish. Or how about commanding versus domineering? Both mean that you have an authoritative kind of presence, but the one, commanding, is a positive thing, and domineering, a negative thing. Their connotations are very different. And it's not just words that have kind of slightly different shades of meaning that the poet must be aware of. Any word also carries with it associations, right? Uh, so I don't know. Here's an example. Here's a list of coins, and what I'd like you to do is you see this list of coins, is think about the mental image that appears in your mind as you hear each one. Now, of course, the coins mean different things and are the currencies of different nations and so on, but all of them carry a mental picture for you, right? So that if a poem were to talk about spending a shilling, you might think of a kind of a Mary Poppins, little British children kind of situation. If a poem were to talk about a nickel, that's not just a U.S. currency. Of course it is, but it also kind of has these, I don't know, for me anyway, it has these kind of 1950s boy in a suspenders going to buy candy kind of associations, right? So one other way I'd like to see this is to look at a poem by Emily Dickinson, and to draw attention to the effect of particular diction choices, I'd like to consider what would happen if Dickinson had chosen a different word, right? So this is a very famous poem of hers. There is no frigate like a book to take us lands away, nor any coursers like a page of prancing poetry. This traverse may the poorest take, without a press of toll. How frugal is the chariot that bears the human soul. So what I've done with this poem is mauled it in horrible ways. I've taken some of the key words in this poem and just changed them. There is no rowboat like a book to take us lands away, nor any ponies like a page of prancing poetry. This highway may the poorest take, without a press of toll. How frugal is the motor car that bears the human soul. Now, all of those words still fit the meter and are similar in meaning to the word that Dickinson chose, but I'm going to argue that they're very different in the connotations that we as readers bring to each of those words. So, for example, a rowboat is a small boat that one or two people would be in and would power by their own rowing, whereas a frigate is a large warship and maybe particularly in our imaginations, kind of an old-fashioned ship. Similarly, ponies are small animals, but coursers are racehorses. So she didn't say just nor any horses like a page. She said coursers, racehorses. So frigate and coursers, they're both especially like impressive and powerful modes of transportation. This highway, she doesn't say that. She says this traverse. Now, traverse just means road or highway. But when you hear the word highway, you might have associations that are a bit lower than the kind of high tone that Emily Dickinson is taking here, right? A highway is kind of a place you trudge along. You might meet a highwayman who stops you and tries to take your money. But a traverse sounds like the scenic road, I guess. And of course, she doesn't say how frugal is the motor car. She says chariot. Again, a very old-fashioned, noble, regal, biblical even mode of transportation. Now, that collection of words works well together because Dickinson's poem is about the power of poetry to provide this ennobling sort of journey for the human soul. And so she uses words that have a powerful and noble connotation.